start with a melody and a prayer, and then an invitation. This is a yahrzeit candle which has been lit, which I light. I'm keeping them burning during these days of the pandemic, because so many souls, over 100,000 souls on Turtle Island, have been taken from us during this time. And of course, I light this candle for Regina Jonas, who is one story in a story of 6 million, whose story I will tell tonight, and the way her story interconnects with others in her story. And I light this candle for George, who last words were, "I cannot breathe. I can't breathe. Sir, please, I can't breathe." This candle is for all these souls whose breath was taken away from them for unjust reasons, because they were not deemed by society and governance to have lives. And so I tell this story tonight to speak for all of us who are gathered here, and the stories we carry in our own hearts of those lives who were perhaps forgotten or made invisible, and whose breath of life was taken away. But through our breath and our commitment to story, we tell their stories and bring them back into our memory. And it seems right before I sing to also offer some tobacco. This is a tobacco. And this tobacco was given to me from people in New Mexico at a time when we stood in solidarity to protect a sacred site. That was a long time ago, this tobacco. And in the tradition of Ohlone people and indigenous people on Turtle Island, who represent so many different cultures and peoples and languages and points of view, I offer this tobacco in this plant, and I will return this to the earth as we lay down prayers for the indigenous people of Turtle Island and the people who were brought here as slaves, that tshuva be accomplished with truth-telling and reparations and guarantees of non-repeat. For this is what the Torah looks like in the days of pandemic. And so this song is from the 23rd Psalm. Even though a person disappears from our view when they pass, their spirit walks with us, accompanies us. And in the context of that memory, we can overcome our fear. Gam ki elech b'getz al mavet lo irara ki ata imadi. Gam כי אלך בגץ על מוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי. In the chat, if you would like to write, you are invited, if you would like to write any names of the people that you are dedicating this hour, this study to at this time. This is how Jewish people have initiated our most important cultural weapon of the resistance of the spirit, and that is the study of Torah. When we gather to do this sacred task, we often dedicate our study to someone. Well, this story, Regina Jonas, means a lot to me. And thank you so much for giving your time to hear this story. I know it's been a hard week, and I'm sure a lot of us have been on Zoom a lot this week. So really, I thank you so much. This story speaks, especially in a week like this. You know, the German people committed genocide, and it was complex, and it was well carried out, and it was supported by so many different pillars of society, from the religious community to the industrial community to, scouts. It was directed at the bodies of women, the bodies of queer and trans folk, the bodies of Jews, and other bodies as well, the bodies of political resistors. And during this time, a young person decided that she wanted to become a rabbi. And so she arose in this time. What an amazing time. And she literally had no other models around her. And as someone who went to rabbinic school with another female-bodied person for the first year, and then no one in my class for all the rest of the years, who was also a woman studying to be a rabbi, her story really spoke to me. I discovered her only by name only in this massive Jewish history book. And I looked at, this was in the early 70s, and I looked around for her. I tried to find, back in the day when there was no Google and you actually had to go to the library, and talk to people and all this kind of stuff. And there was literally nothing about her. I could find nothing. And so I want to tell you a little something about her, who she was. She was born in Berlin on August 3rd, 1902. She was born to Wolf and Sarah Jonas, or Jonas. She grew up in a very poor neighborhood, mostly Jewish neighborhood. Her dad died when she was still pretty young, 1913. He was probably her first teacher, because Jewish learning was conveyed by your parents at home. It's really not known how she was inspired to become a rabbi, but early on, even in high school, she had a great passion for Jewish history and Bible in Hebrew. And so she began to fashion herself as a rabbinic scholar. She studied from 1924 and 1930 at the Academy for the Science of Judaism. That's so German Jewish. The Science of Judaism. They invented the term. Where she wrote the very first ever rabbinic treatise, Can Women Serve as Rabbis? She wrote that in 1930. she had to get permission to write it, and she was given permission by her teacher to write it, to whom she was grateful. And it's clear that in 1930, when she handed it in, that was not the final version, because there are notes on the paper. So it was also an evolving work, like a collection of commentaries. As far as we know, Regina had no other university education. She was old school. She pursued rabbinic learning. I have no doubt that she was well read in her time, because she just expresses this tremendous love of learning. She delivered a dissertation, her halachic dissertation, in the summer of 1930, and she was ordained December 27th, 1935, by the liberal rabbi Max Dinneman in the city of Offenbach, and she was 32 years old. The story of how she actually completed rabbinic school but didn't get the ordination she was seeking, because as yet it was not fully accepted that a woman should be a rabbi, is exactly what I experienced in my own life. That is my story too. So it makes me feel very close. And for me, Zalman Schachter, who I was the first woman he ordained, and Everett Gendler, they, to me, are like Max Dinneman and Leo Beck, who conferred ordination on her, even though she went through seminary and passed, the exams and all of that. She was never assigned a formal congregation due to this rift, but her professional life encompassed a wide range of activities, which she wrote about as, what does a rabbi do? And the way she decided whether women could be rabbis or not is she outlined the different tasks that a rabbi has and carries out, and then looked at tradition to see if women in the past carried out that role. And on that basis, she determined that there are enough threads of approval within the tradition that she could amplify them and expand upon them. She she was a chaplain. She believed that spiritual counseling was at the heart of her work. You can imagine why, being a rabbi in the middle of the Holocaust. She engaged in cultural innovation. That also makes a lot of sense, considering that she was publicly defining a role that no woman had publicly defined in Europe. She engaged in ceremonial leadership, scholarly research and writing, religious education, teaching, chaplaincy. She served at hospitals, old age homes, and she also served in the school of the deaf. Now, when I read this about her, wow, because some of you know that my first congregation was Temple Beth Or of the deaf. And another thread for me to connect to her, Regina helped define the scope and activity of a modern rabbi, in addition to women in spiritual leadership within the Jewish community. And she did that in part because of her positionality as a very grassroots person. Even though she never had a formal congregation, which would have been appointed by the whole community, she nonetheless served and came into contact, you might say, with people on the very front line, and people who needed serving in a way that many male rabbis did not serve, which was not serving pastorally. She rejected, as you might imagine, Regina Jonas rejected the idea that women's place was limited to the private realm and subject to the control of men. This was a view, by the way, very popular in the Aryanism of the period, the Nazi regime, and we see the parallel in our community on Turtle Island today in white supremacy, that the sanctioned role for women, and the only sanctioned role for women, in a society in which queer people are criminalized, right? The pink triangle. That this biological concept of womanhood meant that women could only reproduce and serve in the domestic sphere. And this is during a time when Germany is engaging in eugenics, right? The forced sterilization of non-Aryan populations, as well as people considered unfit or unworthy of producing life or having children, which meant that people with special needs were targeted, queer people were targeted, and this definition of lives that didn't matter as sort of the canary in the coal mine to see how far this systematic violence could go. These were the very communities that Regina Jonas chose to serve. So this is very powerful, you know. And I the more I read about Regina Jonas, I started thinking of her as a kind of very proper version of Harriet Tubman, because Regina believed she had a very I don't know, a very clear idea of a kind of modesty that should accompany such a public role. She thought that that women rabbis should educate and uplift Jewish people, and not just Jewish people, but that was really all she was able to do at that time. She pioneered the dismantling of millennium-long barriers to women's equal participation in Jewish life, being counted in a minyan, giving witness at a trial, teaching in public, singing in public, many, many things, while her people were being slaughtered by the millions all around her. She did indeed serve 55,000 Jews in the Berlin Jewish community and the Jews of Theresienstadt concentration camp, where she was deported to in 1942 until she died in Auschwitz in 1944. She was only 42 years old. She left 2 documents, a halachic treatise and a document of ordination. This story that I'm telling you was unknown until the early 90s. That's why I couldn't find these documents. No one had anything to say about her. Although she was the first formally ordained woman rabbi of Europe, Chana Rochel of Ludmir functioned as a Hasidic rabbi earlier, a generation earlier, and Asnat Barzani was the first widely recognized rabbi, maybe in the world. She was in Kurdistan in the early 1500s. But Regina, who was ordained by the whole community, was completely forgotten. Her papers were discovered in, well, what happened is that even people that we know about, like Viktor Frankl, you may have heard of Viktor Frankl, the psychologist, who's well known, and Leo Beck, who is a well-known German Jewish scholar, and one of the teachers who ordained her. They survived the war. They worked with her. They were in Theresienstadt together. One of them ordained her, and they never spoke a word. They didn't. So she delivered her papers to a friend of hers just before her deportation. And it's a miracle that her papers survived. They were discovered in 1991 in a small archive in East Germany by a Christian German theologian named Dr. Katharina von Kellenbach, a researcher and lecturer she was at St. Mary's College in Maryland. Dr. von Kellenbach's uncle was tried for crimes against the Polish Jewish population of Pinsk. So her uncle was a Nazi. And she decided to devote her scholarly research to challenging the new wave of anti-Jewish expression emerging in German Protestant feminism, and to uncover the way in which the Christian doctrine of forgiveness was used to avoid dealing with Germany's Nazi past. This, to me, is what reparations looks like. Like when we think of our role as white people in what happened to indigenous people and what is ongoing harm and the ongoing harm of racism, then I think that Katerina's actions are a model of reparations for us to think about what she did. And she received an envelope in which all of Regina's papers were stored, and she delivered them back to the German Jewish community. And then when she found out that a woman named Elisa Klapek, who wrote this book that has become where you can read about Regina Jonas in her own words, her treatise is in here. When she started to get interested in Regina, she went to Katerina, and Katerina helped her with a lot of her research. For instance, she helped her track down deportation lists so that they could get very precise with the research about when Regina and her mom were deported. And that's kind of amazing. Regina inspired Elisa Klapek to become one of the first women rabbis ordained in Germany and the first German Jewish rabbi in 75 years since the Holocaust to be ordained as a German Jewish rabbi. She was ordained in 2004 by Aleph, and in 2005, Elisa became the rabbi of Beit HaChidush, the House of Renewal in Amsterdam. So, in this way, it's just really amazing to think about what tremendous courage this circle of us who care about these stories have had in preserving the stories and bringing them back to life and making them meaningful again by the sheer determination not to let them be forgotten. It's such a healing transmission. Now there is a house dedicated to Regina. I want to talk another minute about the remembrance, because I think a lot as queer people and women and people of color and people whose voices are marginalized, the impact of being forgotten in history is overwhelmingly destructive to cultural remembrance and carrying on culture, being able to preserve culture. And so is the impact of sexism. Regina said, quote, "I personally love this profession, being a rabbi, and if ever possible, I also want to practice it." On the last page of her treatise, she concludes, "Almost nothing halachically but prejudice and lack of familiarity stand against women holding rabbinic office." So she's pointing to a basic truth, right? A very basic truth is prejudice perception. She was dismantled really by her own community too. On the one hand, she was Orthodox practicing, or I should say traditional practicing. She never carried a handbag on Shabbat. She was known for carrying, doing the kerchief thing around her wrist. And I've actually seen, maybe some of you remember your grandmothers doing this. This seems to be a very Jewishy thing to do. You put your kerchief around your wrist. And she thought rabbis should wear purple. She thought rabbis should dress modestly. But people responded to her in a variety of ways. People got the impression she wasn't interested in men. When I read that, and this is because Elsa and others started finding survivors who remembered Regina and starting asking them questions about if, to transmit oral history. So they were building this oral history part. And everyone got the impression that she wasn't interested in men. And I just remember that from my own experience, people asking me if I liked men when I was a baby rabbi. The first time people would ask me if I liked men, because I was talking about women's equality. And that was such a weird question. People said she was hysterical. She liked to show herself off against men. Her treatise was nothing special. It was a cold cup of coffee. Her certificate of ordination was not genuine. No one took her seriously. She was only a preacher, not a rabbi. She only rose to fame because other rabbis left Europe. People called her Mrs. Rabbi Regina Jonas, as in a kind of, even though that was sort of correct, it was. So all of these pieces were demeaning. They were demeaning of her memory. And my first 10, 15 years of being me as a rabbi, I heard almost every single one of those things directed at myself. And I don't think I would, if that was the only voice that was coming through, at some point, it probably would have shut me down. So on the other hand, there were her teachers and professors, male scholars who accepted her and taught her, and a few even ordained her. So she was catching the forward edge. And it also seems that young people at the time also loved her as a teacher. They found her unforgettably beautiful. They said she made learning interesting. They liked that she emphasized the equality of men and women, that women could have professions. So you can see that as she's remembered and somehow reflecting the gaze of that time, she's confronting the incredible sexism, the genocidal patriarchy of Nazi Germany and its view of women, and how that crosses over with how people are responding to her as a cultural innovator, while she is telling her own community the entire story of women in Judaism, from the biblical period to the current day. She names and describes the public leadership and the roles of women in the Bible, of women in the rabbinic period, of women in the medieval period, across Jewish geography. So that's kind of amazing too, this idea that to answer sexism, she also has to revive the stories of women and queer folk whose stories are neglected or put in a very narrow box. And so the fullness of their story and the fullness of what they have to offer isn't really understood. So it's viewed from the lens of the domestic. One way in terms of her halachic reasoning that also really struck me was her discussion of whether women could be called to read from the Torah in public and recite an aliyah in public. And this is recent. So this was not even agreed upon when in the mid 80s. It was still an issue. It's still an issue in the Orthodox community, right? So in every case where Regina found a negative in the tradition, she finds a positive. So where there's a story where somebody's saying something they really don't want to hear about women, something that's so stupid, and you're just like, ugh. She finds that a pathway to a different kind of view. So one example that she cites is that it's mentioned in Megillah, in the Talmud, a discussion in the context of reading the scroll of Esther, goes to reading, being called up for an aliyah to the Torah, whether women can do that or not. And the answer is yes, anybody, including women, including people who are still indentured servants. So, the whole class of people who you're asking about, yes, they could all be called up, but women not, because it might offend the honor of the congregation. Here it means a man might get offended. And in my own life, in the 70s, I was invited to a conservadox synagogue, and I was invited to sit on the bima as a guest of the rabbi. And I didn't realize that I was actually the first female-bodied rabbi to do that, to be up there. And when people walked in, they were so distressed to see me up there that a couple people came up and literally tried to pull me off the bima. That didn't happen, and I resolved it nonviolently. But then the rabbi said, okay, we're going to have a discussion when the Torah is open, that the Torah serves as our judge, and we can talk about whether that's okay or not to have women. And one of the things that I cited was this Megillah 23, A and B, and I found myself, and I hadn't heard of Regina Jonas yet, right? But I found myself actually engaged in the same sort of tactic, which is to recover, be in recovery, and to put a list and a name and a biography of every single thing in Judaism that had to do with women up to that point. And I know that's what she did too. And so in the 1990s, when I discovered her work, I was like, wow, what would that have been like if I'd actually just had a handbook ready to go? I want to end before I open it to questions and, sort of conversation about what Regina did. Another thing that Regina did related to the Holocaust. She decided not to leave. This is very moving because I recently heard German Jews in Berlin having a conversation of what it meant actually to stay in Germany and to try to rebuild after the war, and the position that Jews hold now. I can send a link about that conversation. It was through the Center for Jewish Studies here in Berkeley that conversation took place. Amazing conversation. Regina stayed. She felt, for one thing, she could not leave her mother behind. Her mother was old and she did not want to leave her. And amazingly enough, to the very end, they were together. They survived the war together. I mean, they survived up to the point that they were both killed in Auschwitz. They walked that path together. And that's something that I want to honor, because a lot of times we think about people, they either fled, and she had the opportunity to be a refugee. They either tried to flee, and of course, you know, this is not to critique, or they hid, of course. She decided to remain public and to be public with her life in that context. It's just something I want to honor about her. Her job when she got to Theresen was, alongside Viktor Frankl, to welcome Jewish people off the transport. So she was the person who stood, the face they saw, her face, as they stepped off the cattle cars into Theresen. And she led them, accompanied them to their barracks. And this idea of accompaniment and going to the front lines where the most wounded dwell, and to bring a sense of pastoral care, some skillfulness, some mutual aid, that is something that I see again and again on the front lines. And it's a very dear thing. It's a very beautiful thing to witness. I imagined what her last day was like. She gave 29 sermons while she was in Theresen. That's a lot. And I can imagine that that she was constantly in conversation as well. She slept on the third tier of the wooden bunk in the barrack that she was at, where I imagine she would lie awake, you know, in exhaustion. Every hour before dawn, she would put on her hat. She would make her ablution and put on her hat, and go to the ground with the same prayerful devotion that men put on tefillin. This rabbinic hat, this was her rabbinic hat, and she wore it as a sign of her service. She's called a Seelsorger. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Seelsorger. And that's a caregiver. It's a soul caretaker, caregiver to the soul. That's how she saw herself. So I'm going to skip to something that I put together from all of her words, and that is her last sermon, the last sermon that she gave in Theresen before the transport. I hope it honors her, and I hope it gives you a feel for what I experience as the passion of her life. My beloved friends, let us conduct ourselves as did our Talmudic sister Bruria, who kept the death of her sons hidden from her husband during Shabbat by telling him, Meir, our sons are away. When the ritual of Havdalah was performed, Meir asked for the children, and Bruria said, Meir, what if a person were loaned 2 precious jewels, and then after many years, the owner of those jewels requested their return? Should the borrower give them back? Or since they had grown to love them, keep them in their house? Meir was surprised. why you must return the jewels, of course. They were only a loan. And Meir wondered why his wife asked him such a simple halachic question when he was sure she already knew the answer, and his heart beat faster. She touched his shoulder, Beria did, and said, "So it is with us. The one to whom these jewels belong has come for their precious possessions. Our two precious jewels have been taken back home. Blessed is the one who gives. Blessed is the one who takes away. My friends, so it is with us. We are returning home. In these times of fog and fire, we must have faith that our lives have not been lived in vain, that we are here for a purpose, the same purpose that has been our guiding light since the day we stood at Sinai, received our precious Torah, and pledged ourselves and our children to struggle for goodness and peace in the world. Even though we find ourselves abandoned without hope, let us comfort each other with words and deeds of kindness. Even though we struggle to survive in conditions of extreme cruelty the world cannot yet imagine, we remain determined to do good to others wherever we go. Sometimes, as we know, struggles lead us into darkness instead of light. And sometimes our struggles are not successful despite our best effort. But that is no reason to lose faith in our ancient calling to be a gentle people above all else. Spiritual leadership is given to those who are loyal to the struggle for goodness, regardless of social rank or perceived national superiority. Tonight, as I stand before you for the last time, I pray that we may be remembered not for how we died, but for how we lived. As it is written about the death of the righteous matriarch, Sarah, of blessed memory, she lived 127 years. My friends, let me assure you that it has meant more to me to have stayed in Germany than to leave you behind for my own personal fame and comfort. Besides, I could not leave my dear mother. To be with you here is the path I have chosen. As Ruth said to Naomi, do not ask me to leave you, for where you go, I go. And wherever you dwell, I will dwell. Your people shall be my people. Your God shall be my God. Where you die, I shall die, and there I will be buried. Perhaps that is why God called me forth as a woman rabbi at this time, to walk with those I love in a time of abandonment and exile. Our scripture and its holy regulations are dedicated to the spirit of freedom. It is the spirit of freedom that speaks through the text, that enlivens the text, that gives meaning to the whole. It must be this spirit of liberation, the same spirit of liberation that caused our ancestors to rise up against their unjust servitude. This same spirit speaks in favor of all women in leadership positions as well. I hope a time will come for all of us in which there will be no more questions on the subject of women. For as long as there are questions, something is wrong. Perhaps it is the role of women to be the custodians and upholders of compassion and justice, of all that is good and right, of love and kindness. Where we enter, hate and enmity must fall silent. This is what it means to create and maintain religious culture and to point the way to faith through ritual and rites. Our Jewish people is sent from God into history as a blessed people. Wherever one steps in life, in every situation, we are asked to bestow blessing, grant goodness and faithfulness. This is the way of humility before God's selflessness, whose devotion and full love for their creatures maintains the world. To establish these pillars of the world was and is our task as a people. Every person can undertake this work with the same faithfulness as our ancestors. This ideal has served us well in Terezin. Tonight, like Beria, we kiss each other goodbye. May all our work, which we have tried to perform as God's servants, be a blessing for our future and for all humanity. Amen. So, my goodness gracious. I invite you to raise your little hand, if you, I think it's in the part, I'm not sure where the hand raise is. Dory, you want to help us with that?
Yeah, if you go to the bottom of your screen and open participants, you'll see a side panel, and at the bottom of that side panel, there's a little raise your hand icon if you have any questions. Chat with me if you have any troubles finding it. Yavni has a question. I'm unmuting you, Yavni. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. That was inspiring. Thank you very much. Was Regina aware of the Maiden of Ludmir and Asenat? I didn't catch the last name.
Barzani. She did list many women that I had never heard of, and I suggest you go to her book. I did not see Asnat Barzani in that list. I suspect if she had lived and things were not Nazi Germany, she would have learned about her, because she was also, her story also was not well known outside of the Sephardic, outside of the community of Kurdistan. And only now, there's some folk tales are now being recovered. Howard Schwartz has recovered some of her folk tales. There's works about her in Hebrew. And you can always go to Jewish Women's Archives to start the trail of research on women. And whether, she also didn't mention Hannah Rochel of Ludmir either, who did choose to leave. Hannah Rochel was kicked out of her town, even though she she had her own shtibel and her own following. She was a Hasidic Rebbe. And one very beautiful thing about Chana Rachel, which I think resonates, is when Chana Rachel got to Palestine, which is where she went, it is said of her that she had students from among Palestinian Christian and Muslims, and every Rosh Chodesh, it's just so foreshadowing of where we are now. Every Rosh Chodesh, she would go to Rachel's tomb, which was then open. Now it's a fortress, but then it was open. You can see pictures of it in some of the Jewish synagogues in Tzfat that were painted in the 1500s of Kever Rachel. It was a favorite icon. And so she would go there and host new moon ceremonies and teaching and healing on Rosh Chodesh. And there's also a beautiful story of Chana Rachel that as a Kabbalist, she and one of her colleagues determined that they figured out when the Messiah would come, that if they would go to such and such a place at such and such a time and say such and such a prayer, that they could bring the Messiah. So they get up at and they both head in the direction of such and such a place in Jerusalem at such and such a time. But on the way, Chana Rachel sees somebody who's in need, and so she stops and she tends to that person's immediate need. And then, of course, they miss the hour. But of course, that is the ancient Jewish teaching. It's an old Talmudic teaching. So I think this idea of by serving in the most compassionate way you can to where the wound is greatest in any moment, with love and compassion, that is indeed how you bring that time we long for when inequity is no more.
Lynn, we'll have a final question from Abigail, but first, there's a quick question in the chat. The words that you read, were they in the Regina Jonas book, or did you get them from somewhere else?
They're in here.
Okay.
And
Abigail, do you want to add?
and with a few conversation. I actually studied, believe it or not, with a student of Leo Baeck. Regina Jonas was ordained by Leo Baeck, and his student, Leo Baeck's student, was my teacher in Israel. It's just that it's amazing to know that your life crosses paths with a person that you don't. It's like this beautiful spiritual light that is going with you that you don't know about, and then one day you see it, and it's just so deeply touching. So Abigail, shalom.
I more or less want to remind you that you were my first woman rabbi, and I saw your name on a conference, and I went there because you were there to this women's spirituality conference, and I followed you around like a puppy dog the entire weekend because you were a woman rabbi. And I had never heard of such a thing. This was 40 years ago.
Well, I gotta say, I am so glad not to get the look anymore. Not by you. You did not give me that look. But the look that I sometimes got where people would ask me, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm a woman rabbi. I'm a rabbi, sorry, not a woman. I'm a rabbi. And then they would look at me starting here and then going down to my shoes, take a little romp around my shoes and then come back up and say, are you a woman rabbi? And I used to love to say, because I've always had this hair, no. But but that's a little maybe too comic for tonight. Yes, I know that just having to be a queer person, be a person of color, be have something special that you want to do in the world, and constantly being limited, you know, put in this little box and then having to break out of it is, and as a Jewish person, that as a result of all the internalized anti-Semitism that we carry, these are profound, profound challenges, and may we all overcome. I know that we're all looking at mutual aid right now, which is such a beautiful thing, grassroots mutual aid, and looking at ways that from our sheltering we can be supportive of each other. May we continue to tell each other stories and support each other lovingly to the best of our ability. I think the recording will be available, and you can find out more about Chochmat HaLev. I just love working at Chochmat HaLev. This is my home gallery, but all the fun that's happening here also happens there. If you have, just stay tuned. I'll be teaching a class this summer. Not sure what yet. If you want to study with me, just reach out to me, lynn@chochmat.org. If you have kids that you want to be part of a fantastic family and youth program, reach out to me. And I look forward to giving you, let's give each other hugs. Oh my God.